The chief executive dropped a crumpled $100 bill onto the hangar floor and laughed in front of the engineers, calling the single father beside her a cheap mechanic who did not belong near her jets. She wagered $10 million he could not restart the dead aircraft after 3 teams of specialists had failed. Mason Reed only bent down, picked up the bill, whooped the grease from his fingers, and walked toward the technical bay without a word. 7 minutes later, the hangar shook as the engine roared to life, and the truth behind that jet left her speechless. The private hangar on the outskirts of Dallas smelled of jet fuel and cold steel, the kind of place where money spoke louder than any voice inside it. Beneath the high fluorescent lights sat an $80 million jet, silent and lifeless, its engines refusing to answer even the most experienced hands in the company. Amelia Carter stood near the nose of the aircraft with her arms folded, her tailored coat catching the shine of the overhead lamps, her patience worn thin after 9 straight hours of failure. She was due to sign a shipping contract worth $200 million by morning, a deal that depended entirely on this jet leaving the ground on schedule. Her senior engineering team had rotated through the cockpit and the maintenance bay all through the night, running diagnostics, replacing sensors, and rewriting flight logs, yet the engine would not turn over. Jackson Vale, the team lead, wiped his forehead and insisted the fault was buried somewhere in the wiring harness, though even he could not say exactly where. Investors from the shipping partner sat in folding chairs near the hangar wall, watching the clock, watching Amelia's composure fracture with every passing minute. It was in that tension that a quiet contract mechanic named Mason Reed stepped closer, listening not to the arguments around him but to the faint clicking of a relay somewhere beneath the fuselage. He crouched near the landing gear, tilting his head as though the machine itself were whispering something the others had missed. The smell of fuel told him one story, the sound of the relay told him another, and together they suggested a fault none of the expensive diagnostic tools in the room had bothered to consider. Jackson noticed him first and let out a short, humorless laugh, asking the room if someone had let the janitor wander too close to a real aircraft. A few of the younger engineers chuckled nervously, more out of exhaustion than genuine amusement, while Mason said nothing and kept his eyes on the undercarriage. Amelia turned at the sound of the laughter, grateful for anything that might break the suffocating tension building inside her chest. When she learned that the man crouched by the landing gear was merely a contract mechanic, hired for odd hours because of some vague personal circumstance, her patience finally snapped entirely. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a single crumpled $100 bill, and let it fall to the concrete floor in front of him, the gesture landing harder than any words could have. She told him plainly that his skill set belonged in a roadside garage, not in a hangar housing machines worth more than his entire life. The room went quiet in the particular way that precedes either violence or spectacle, no one certain which one they were about to witness. Mason did not raise his voice or straighten his back in offense. He simply looked down at the bill lying near his boots, then back up at the woman who had thrown it. Amelia, emboldened by his silence and desperate to reclaim some sense of control in front of her investors, offered a wager she fully expected to win without effort. If he could restart the jet within 7 minutes, when 3 professional teams had failed across 9 hours, she would pay him $10 million on the spot. Laughter rippled through the hangar again, sharper this time, confident in the impossibility of what she had just proposed. Jackson grinned and started an imaginary countdown under his breath, certain the mechanic would slink away in embarrassment rather than accept a bet designed to humiliate him further. The investors leaned forward with the interest of people watching a show rather than a business deal, some already reaching for their phones to record whatever might happen next. Mason let the silence stretch a moment longer, the way a man does when he has already decided something the rest of the room has not yet understood. Mason bent down slowly and picked up the crumpled bill, brushing the grease from his fingers before folding it into his shirt pocket without a trace of anger on his face. He did not smile, did not gloat, and did not offer any of the sharp retorts that might have satisfied the watching crowd. Instead, he asked for 3 things in a voice too calm for the room he stood in: that every auxiliary power source be shut down completely, that the left technical bay be opened for him, and that no one touch the control panel while he worked. Amelia arched an eyebrow, half convinced this was theater meant to buy him time before he inevitably admitted defeat. Jackson scoffed and muttered to the nearest engineer that the man was clearly stalling, buying himself a graceful exit rather than a genuine attempt at repair. Still, Amelia gave the order, more out of curiosity than belief, and watched as the hangar lights dimmed slightly when the auxiliary systems powered down one by one. Jackson, unwilling to let the moment pass without asserting himself, walked to the wall panel and started a visible countdown timer, letting the red digits glow above the jet like a verdict waiting to be delivered. He wanted everyone in the room to watch Mason fail against the clock rather than in silence. Mason ignored the timer entirely and lowered himself into the open technical bay, pressing his palm flat against the cool metal casing near the fuel line. He closed his eyes for a moment, the way a physician might rest two fingers against a patient's wrist, feeling for a rhythm rather than reading a printout. The engineers around him had spent 9 hours trusting screens and diagnostic software, but Mason trusted the subtle vibration traveling up through his palm. Language machines had spoken to him long before any of these men had entered the industry. Within seconds, he understood that the failure had nothing to do with fuel pressure or spark timing at all. The problem, he realized, was buried in the electronic fuel lockout system, a safety mechanism designed to prevent ignition under unsafe conditions. Somewhere in that system, a single component had been swapped, its specifications altered just enough that the jet's own computer had decided, correctly by its programming, that it should never start. It was not damage in the traditional sense, not a broken part crying out to be replaced, but a deliberate falsehood fed into the aircraft's logic, causing it to protect itself from a threat that did not exist. Mason traced the wiring with steady fingers, already forming a picture of what had been done and, more troublingly, who might have done it. He said nothing of his suspicions yet, choosing instead to keep his focus on the physical task in front of him while the countdown numbers ticked downward behind his back. Amelia watched him work with a strange, unfamiliar curiosity, noticing the economy of his movements, the total absence of hesitation in a man everyone in the room had already dismissed. Jackson's confidence began to waver slightly as the seconds passed without the failure he had been counting on, though he covered it by loudly reminding everyone how many experts had already tried and failed at this exact task. Mason simply reached deeper into the bay, his hands moving with the quiet certainty of someone who had done this kind of work long before anyone here had learned his name. When the first minute passed, Mason had already traced the fuel line from the tank to the injection manifold, running his fingers along each joint in search of a leak or a loose coupling that the diagnostic software might have overlooked. He found nothing wrong there, which told him as much as finding a fault would have, narrowing the problem further into the electronic systems rather than the mechanical ones. The countdown behind him read 6 minutes remaining, its red glow reflecting faintly off the polished fuselage, though Mason worked as if the clock did not exist at all. Amelia found herself glancing between his hands and the timer, unable to decide which one deserved more of her attention. By the second minute, Mason had opened the pressure regulator housing, unscrewing the casing with practiced ease and examining the internal seals for signs of tampering. The regulator itself was fine, but the wiring harness feeding into it bore the faint marks of having been disconnected and reconnected more recently than the maintenance logs would suggest. Jackson, sensing the mechanic's growing focus, stepped closer to the bay under the pretense of offering assistance, though his real intention was to disrupt Mason's rhythm and remind the room who was supposed to be in charge. Mason simply shifted his shoulder to block the intrusion, never once losing his place in the wiring diagram forming inside his mind. The third minute ticked by with Jackson hovering uncomfortably close, asking pointed questions about procedure that Mason answered only with silence, his attention entirely consumed by the task at hand. By the fourth minute, Mason's fingers found what he had been searching for, a small security chip embedded near the fuel lockout controller, its casing subtly different from the specification plate bolted beside it. It was the kind of substitution only someone with intimate access to the aircraft could have made, a chip designed to trigger false lockout signals under specific, deliberately engineered conditions. Amelia, watching from a few feet away, began to feel the first cold edge of suspicion creep into her own certainty about her team. In the fifth minute, that suspicion sharpened into something closer to dread as she realized the sabotage, if that was truly what this was, had come from inside her own operation rather than from any outside threat. Mason worked faster now, though his hands never betrayed panic, each motion deliberate even as the clock pressed toward its final moments. In the sixth minute, he pulled a short length of wire from his tool roll and fashioned a manual bridge across the compromised circuit, rerouting the signal path around the falsified chip entirely rather than attempting to remove it under time pressure. It was an improvised solution, the kind that came only from years of understanding not just how a system was supposed to work, but how it could be coaxed into working despite deliberate damage. As the 7th minute began, Mason closed the technical bay panel and rose to his feet, wiping his hands on a rag before signaling calmly to the pilot seated in the cockpit to attempt ignition. For a moment nothing happened, and the silence in the hangar stretched taut enough that even Jackson stopped breathing. Then the engine caught, a low growl building rapidly into a full, thunderous roar that rattled the metal walls and sent a visible tremor through the concrete floor beneath everyone's feet. The entire hangar fell into stunned silence, broken only by the deep, steady sound of an $80 million aircraft finally, impossibly, coming back to life. Amelia stood frozen as the engine's roar settled into a steady, powerful hum, her mind struggling to reconcile what she had just witnessed with everything she had believed only minutes earlier. A man she had dismissed as unworthy of standing near her aircraft had accomplished in 7 minutes what her most credentialed engineers had failed to achieve across 9 grueling hours. The investors who had been watching with detached amusement now rose from their folding chairs, breaking into applause that echoed strangely off the hangar's high metal ceiling, their earlier boredom replaced entirely by genuine astonishment. Some of them exchanged glances that suggested this unexpected turn might make for a better story than the contract signing they had originally come to witness. Mason did not bask in the moment or turn to acknowledge the applause building around him. He walked back toward Amelia with the same unhurried pace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, reached into his shirt pocket, and placed the $100 bill back on a nearby workbench without a word of triumph. When he finally spoke, his voice remained level, almost gentle, as he told her plainly that the aircraft had not simply broken down on its own, that what she had witnessed was not mechanical failure but something engineered to look that way. Amelia's expression shifted from disbelief to something colder, more alert, as the implications of his statement began to settle over her. Jackson's face had drained of color the moment the engine started, and it grew paler still when Mason mentioned the word engineered in front of the assembled investors. He tried to interject, suggesting loudly that the mechanic was simply grandstanding to inflate his own reputation after a lucky guess, but his voice cracked in a way that undercut his own argument. Amelia held up a hand to silence him, her eyes fixed on Mason instead, and asked the only question that seemed to matter in that moment. What did he actually want from her, now that he had won a bet no one believed he could win? The hangar waited, investors and engineers alike, curious whether this quiet man would demand money, position, or public credit. Mason's answer surprised nearly everyone present, delivered without hesitation and without any hint of negotiation in his tone. He said he did not want the $10 million for himself, not in that moment, and instead asked only that every contract mechanic and hourly technician on her payroll be paid the wages they were currently owed, wages that had been delayed for months under vague budgetary excuses. Amelia blinked, caught off guard by a request so far removed from the greed she had assumed motivated him, and for the first time since he had entered her hangar, she looked at him not as an inconvenience but as a person she genuinely did not understand. It was a small thing to ask, financially speaking, yet it revealed something about him that unsettled her far more than the 7-minute miracle had. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the angle she was certain must exist somewhere beneath his calm exterior, the trick that powerful people always assumed hid behind unexpected generosity. She found nothing but quiet exhaustion and the particular patience of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with people who underestimated him rarely accomplished anything worthwhile. Amelia realized, with a discomfort she was not accustomed to feeling in her own hangar, that she had spent the entire night looking directly at the most competent person in the building without recognizing him at all. The applause faded into murmurs, and somewhere beneath the returning hum of the engine, the real story of that night was only just beginning to surface. With the immediate crisis resolved and the jet's engine still running steadily in the background, Mason asked for access to the aircraft's maintenance history, explaining that the falsified chip he had found was only a symptom of a larger problem hiding within the paperwork. Amelia hesitated only briefly before nodding to one of her assistants, who retrieved a tablet containing the full digital service record for the jet's past 6 months. Mason scrolled through the entries with the same methodical attention he had shown inside the technical bay, his eyes narrowing when he reached a line item dated several weeks earlier. A single component, one that should have cost roughly $400 to replace, had been logged and billed as a full avionics upgrade package worth $2 million. He showed the entry to Amelia without a word, letting the number speak for itself, and watched as her expression hardened into something far more dangerous than the irritation she had shown him back at the hangar door. Piecing the timeline together, Mason explained that someone with detailed knowledge of the aircraft's systems had deliberately induced the failure that had trapped her engineering team for 9 hours, creating an artificial crisis meant to pressure her into approving an inflated maintenance budget without asking too many questions. It was, he said quietly, a common enough scheme in an industry where urgency often overrode scrutiny, especially when a chief executive was already under pressure from a looming contract deadline. Amelia's jaw tightened as she began to understand just how precisely her own urgency had been exploited. Mason then revealed something that placed the betrayal closer to home than she had expected. Month earlier, while working a routine contract shift, he had submitted a technical warning flagging irregularities in this exact aircraft's fuel lockout system, a report he had filed properly through the maintenance software before his access credentials were unexpectedly revoked. When he searched for that report now, it no longer existed anywhere in the system, as though it had never been filed at all. Amelia asked her assistant to pull the deletion logs, and the timestamp that came back matched almost exactly with the week Jackson had taken over final approval authority for all maintenance documentation. The full weight of the situation settled over Amelia slowly, like cold water rising past her ankles toward her knees. Her company, the one she had built her reputation on, the one whose safety record she had used to court investors and secure lucrative contracts, was being quietly hollowed out from within by someone she had trusted enough to promote. She felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to slip, not from public embarrassment this time, but from the private unsettling recognition that she had missed something happening directly under her own authority. She glanced toward Jackson, who stood near the wall pretending to review a clipboard, his posture just slightly too rigid to be natural. Mason, watching her absorb the implications, offered one final piece of information before stepping back to give her room to think. He told her, gently but firmly, that despite the engine now running and the immediate emergency seemingly resolved, she should not authorize this particular aircraft for flight yet, because the falsified chip was not the only irregularity he had noticed during his brief time inside the technical bay. Something else, something potentially more dangerous, had caught his attention in the hydraulic lines feeding the flight control surfaces, a detail he had not yet had time to fully investigate. Amelia looked at him then with an expression that mixed gratitude, suspicion, and something close to fear, uncertain which of those feelings deserved to win out. The shipping partners' representatives, unaware of the deeper crisis unfolding inside the hangar, sent word through Amelia's assistant that the jet needed to be airborne before the day's end or the entire $200 million agreement would be forfeited to a competing carrier. Amelia read the message twice, feeling the familiar weight of business pressure pressing against the new, more troubling knowledge Mason had just given her. Every instinct built over years of running a company screamed at her to simply close the hangar doors, thank the mechanic for his help, and get the jet into the air before anyone asked further questions. Yet something about Mason's quiet warning refused to let her dismiss it as easily as she wanted to. Jackson, sensing an opportunity to regain control of the narrative, stepped forward and insisted loudly that the aircraft was now fully operational and ready for departure, urging Amelia to authorize the flight immediately before they lost the contract entirely. His urgency, Mason noted silently, seemed less about the deadline and more about closing the conversation before anyone examined the hydraulic system too closely. Amelia caught the same undertone, though she kept her expression neutral, unwilling to reveal how much her trust in Jackson had already begun to erode over the past half hour. She asked him directly whether the secondary hydraulic system had been inspected as part of tonight's diagnostics, and he answered too quickly, claiming it had passed every check without issue. Mason interjected calmly, explaining that if the jet took off under current conditions, there was a real possibility the secondary hydraulic backup could lock the flight control surfaces mid-flight, a failure that would leave the pilot with dangerously limited ability to steer the aircraft. It was not a certainty, he admitted, but the risk was significant enough that no responsible technician would clear the plane for departure without first confirming the system's integrity. Amelia found herself caught between three competing pressures pulling in different directions: her company's reputation, the enormous financial cost of losing the shipping contract, and the basic, undeniable obligation to ensure the safety of everyone who might eventually board that aircraft. For a moment, old habits crept back into her thinking, and she wondered aloud whether Mason was exaggerating the danger to leverage more concessions from her, perhaps angling for a permanent position or additional compensation beyond what he had already requested. The suspicion left her mouth before she fully considered it, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, but a weary familiarity with being doubted the moment his usefulness seemed to reach its natural limit. Rather than argue, Mason simply walked back to his tool roll, retrieved a small pressure gauge, and asked one of the younger engineers standing nearby to help him take a direct reading from the hydraulic line in question. The technician, a young woman the crew called Riley, agreed without hesitation, having watched Mason work with a precision that had already earned her quiet respect. Together they took the reading in front of Amelia and the assembled investors, and the gauge confirmed exactly what Mason had warned about: pressure levels inconsistent with a properly functioning secondary system, fluctuating in a pattern that suggested a compromised seal somewhere deeper in the line. Riley looked up at Amelia and confirmed plainly that the mechanic was right, that flying under these conditions would be a serious gamble with the pilot's life, and possibly others aboard. Amelia felt the last of her hesitation give way, replaced by a colder, clearer understanding of just how close she had come to signing off on a disaster. Jackson's composure finally cracked under the weight of the pressure gauge reading, and rather than accepting responsibility, he pivoted sharply, raising his voice to accuse Mason of having sabotaged the hydraulic system himself in order to manufacture a crisis he could then heroically solve for financial gain. It was a bold accusation, delivered with enough confidence that several of the newer engineers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether the story they had just watched unfold might actually be an elaborate con rather than genuine skill. Amelia's expression hardened, though not entirely in the direction Jackson had hoped, her earlier trust in him already too damaged to accept his claim without scrutiny. Still, in front of investors and with $200 million hanging in the balance, she could not simply dismiss the accusation without at least appearing to investigate it. She called for hangar security, a decision that seemed to satisfy Jackson far more than it satisfied her own instincts, and asked that Mason's belongings be checked as a formality before the situation escalated any further. Mason did not resist or protest, standing calmly with his arms slightly raised as two security officers approached him under the harsh overhead lights. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that hangar, how quickly a man without status could be turned from hero to villain in the span of a single accusation, and he had long ago stopped expecting fairness from rooms like this one. The search proceeded in front of the same investors who had applauded him only 20 minutes earlier, their expressions now shifting toward wary suspicion. One of the officers reached into the inner pocket of Mason's work jacket and withdrew a small electronic component, holding it up for the room to see. It was, Jackson announced triumphantly, clear proof that Mason had planted a duplicate of the very chip responsible for the original failure, evidence that he had engineered the entire crisis from the start. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even Amelia felt a fresh wave of doubt rise in her chest, though something about the timing struck her as too convenient, too perfectly aligned with Jackson's own desperate need to redirect blame. Mason looked at the component calmly, recognizing it immediately as a part he had never touched, let alone carried into the hangar himself. He did not raise his voice or plead his innocence the way a guilty man might have, choosing instead a single measured request that seemed almost too simple given the gravity of the accusation against him. He asked that someone review the footage from the technical bay's internal camera, the one positioned directly above the fuel lockout system he had worked on for the entirety of those 7 critical minutes. If he had truly planted evidence or sabotaged anything, the footage would show it plainly, and if he had not, the same footage would clear him just as decisively. Amelia turned to her assistant and instructed that the recording be pulled up immediately on the nearest monitor. Jackson's confident posture faltered for the first time since the accusation began, a subtle shift Amelia caught even amid the chaos of the moment, his eyes darting briefly toward the exit before he forced himself to remain still. The assistant worked at a nearby terminal, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard while the room waited in tense silence, the only sound the low, steady hum of the jet engine that had started this entire chain of events. When the assistant finally looked up, her expression carried a confusion that immediately deepened the unease already spreading through the hangar. The footage, she reported quietly, was gone, deleted from the system entirely sometime within the last hour. The announcement that the footage had vanished sent a fresh murmur through the hangar, and for a brief moment Jackson allowed himself the smallest flicker of relief, believing the missing evidence would settle the matter entirely in his favor. Without proof to contradict his accusation, he assumed the room would default to suspicion of the outsider rather than the trusted engineering lead they had worked alongside for years. Amelia, however, did not share his relief, her attention fixed instead on Mason's calm, almost unbothered reaction to the news that the one piece of evidence capable of clearing him had simply disappeared. A guilty man, she suspected, might have panicked at such a development, yet Mason merely nodded, as though he had half expected exactly this outcome. He explained, in the same unhurried tone he had used throughout the entire ordeal, that the internal camera feed was never the only record of what happened inside that technical bay. Aircraft of this particular model, he said, were manufactured with an independent maintenance recorder, a legacy safety feature installed years earlier and largely forgotten by newer engineering teams who relied exclusively on modern digital logging systems. It operated on its own isolated circuit, disconnected from the primary network entirely, which meant it could not be accessed, altered, or deleted remotely by anyone working through the hangar's standard security terminal. Amelia stared at him, both intrigued and increasingly unsettled by how much this man seemed to know about an aircraft he had only just been allowed to touch that evening. She asked, carefully, how a contract mechanic hired for irregular shifts would possess such detailed knowledge of a legacy system most of her own senior staff had apparently forgotten existed. Mason held her gaze for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable in a way that suggested the answer carried more weight than the question itself implied. He was not simply a mechanic who had gotten lucky with a stubborn engine, he said quietly, but someone who had once worked directly on the certification program for this exact jet model, years before circumstances had pulled him away from that kind of work entirely. The revelation rippled through the hangar with a different kind of force than the earlier applause, quieter but far more disorienting, as engineers who had mocked him only an hour earlier began reconsidering everything they thought they understood about the man in the grease-stained jacket. Jackson's expression shifted from cautious relief to open alarm, his earlier confidence collapsing as the implications settled over him. If Mason truly had access to knowledge this deep, then his earlier warning about the hydraulic system had likely been correct as well, and the independent recorder he had just described would almost certainly contain footage Jackson could neither delete nor explain away. Amelia ordered the recorder retrieved immediately, watching Mason closely as security located the small, unassuming device tucked deep within the avionics bay, exactly where he had said it would be. As the technician connected it to a portable diagnostic unit, the hangar fell into the same taut silence that had accompanied the original countdown, everyone aware that whatever appeared on that small screen would determine far more than a single man's innocence. Mason stood apart from the gathering crowd, hands loosely at his sides, betraying no anxiety about what the footage might reveal, because unlike everyone else in that room, he already knew exactly what it would show. The recorder's footage, once loaded onto the portable diagnostic unit, played back in grainy but unmistakable clarity, showing Mason's hands moving methodically through the technical bay exactly as he had described, with no trace of the tampering Jackson had accused him of committing. It also showed, in the minutes before Mason had even arrived, a second figure working alone near the same panel, a figure whose posture and build were unmistakably Jackson's own. Amelia watched in silence as the timeline confirmed everything Mason had suspected from the very beginning, the falsified chip installed not by the mechanic accused of the crime, but by the engineer who had accused him. With the immediate suspicion lifted and the room's attention shifting entirely to Jackson, Amelia turned back to Mason, her earlier hostility replaced now by a quiet, searching curiosity she could no longer suppress. She asked directly what had brought a man with his evident background to accepting irregular contract work in a hangar, where people barely acknowledged his presence. Mason considered the question for a long moment, aware that the answer touched on parts of his life he rarely discussed with strangers, let alone with the woman who had thrown money at his feet only an hour earlier. He told her, briefly and without self-pity, that he had once held a respected position as a systems engineer specializing in exactly the kind of aircraft certification work that had allowed him to recognize the legacy recorder tonight. Years earlier, a serious accident during a testing procedure, combined with a difficult period in his personal life that left him solely responsible for raising his young daughter, had pushed him away from that demanding career entirely. He had needed flexible hours more than prestige, needed to be present for a small girl who depended on him completely. And contract mechanical work, however undervalued by people like Jackson, had given him exactly that freedom. Amelia absorbed this information slowly, feeling something shift inside her that had little to do with the $200 million contract or the $10 million wager she now owed him. She had spent the evening measuring Mason entirely by the grease on his hands and the plainness of his clothing, never once considering that competence could exist so completely divorced from status or visible ambition. The realization sat uncomfortably alongside the memory of her own laughter earlier that night, the casual cruelty with which she had dismissed a man who had in every meaningful sense been the most capable person in her hangar the entire time. Mason, sensing no further need to dwell on his personal history, redirected the conversation back toward the matter still unresolved in front of them. He opened a small port on the side of the recorder and extracted a secondary data file, one containing detailed logs of every access attempt made to the aircraft's systems over the preceding weeks. The data confirmed, in precise timestamps impossible to dispute, that Jackson had not only installed the falsified chip, but had also been the one to alter the maintenance records and quietly erase Mason's original warning from the company's servers months earlier. The evidence finally existed in a form no one in that hangar could argue away. Amelia turned to face Jackson with an expression that had lost every trace of the warmth she once extended to him as a trusted lead engineer, replaced instead by a cold, deliberate calm that frightened him far more than open anger would have. She asked him plainly, in front of the investors and the assembled staff, to explain the falsified maintenance entries, the deleted warning, and now the recorder footage, placing him alone at the panel before the failure had even begun. Jackson's earlier bravado dissolved almost immediately, his shoulders sagging as he realized the evidence stacked against him had grown too complete to argue away with confidence or misdirection. He offered an explanation that sounded, even to his own ears, thin against the weight of what had just been revealed. He spoke of relentless pressure from above to inflate departmental budgets, of quarterly performance targets that seemed designed to reward exaggerated repair costs rather than honest maintenance, and of a system that had quietly encouraged this kind of behavior long before he had ever touched the fuel lockout chip himself. Amelia listened without interrupting, though her expression made clear that context, however real, did not excuse the danger he had knowingly created inside an aircraft meant to carry human passengers. Mason, still holding the secondary data file, mentioned quietly that the falsified entries were not isolated to this single jet, and that a broader review of the maintenance logs revealed similar inflated invoices tied to at least 3 other aircraft within the company's fleet. Amelia's stomach tightened at the implication, understanding immediately that this was not a single lapse in judgment but a pattern stretching across her entire operation, one that could have resulted in far worse outcomes than a delayed contract signing. The scale of it forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth about how much authority she had allowed to accumulate in the hands of people she had never adequately questioned. For a moment, the old instinct toward damage control flickered through her thinking, the familiar corporate impulse to quietly resolve the matter internally, protect the company's reputation, and avoid the kind of scandal that might unravel investor confidence overnight. She glanced at the assembled investors, aware that her next words would shape not only Jackson's fate but the trajectory of her own leadership going forward. After a long pause, she chose differently than her instincts urged, deciding that concealment now would only compound the danger already created by months of hidden falsification throughout her fleet. She announced, calmly and without hesitation, that Jackson would be suspended immediately pending a full legal investigation into the falsified records and the deliberate endangerment of the aircraft and its intended passengers. Security escorted him from the hangar without further protest, his earlier confidence entirely extinguished, replaced by the quiet dread of a man who understood the consequences awaiting him. Amelia then turned to her remaining staff and ordered that every contract mechanic and hourly technician whose wages had been delayed under Jackson's budget manipulations be paid in full by the end of the week, a promise she intended to keep regardless of the cost it placed on her own department. With Jackson removed from the hangar and the immediate crisis of blame resolved, the practical work of actually clearing the aircraft for safe departure still remained ahead of them, and Mason turned his attention fully toward that task. He gathered the remaining engineering staff, including Riley and several others who had spent the night following Jackson's increasingly desperate instructions, and proposed a complete methodical inspection of every system the falsified records might have touched. Rather than performing the inspection alone and simply announcing the results, as he easily could have given his obvious expertise, he chose instead to walk the younger technicians through each step, explaining not just what to check, but why each check mattered. Amelia observed this choice with quiet interest, noticing how naturally Mason shifted from solitary problem solver to patient instructor once the immediate danger had passed. He never spoke down to the technicians or made them feel foolish for having missed what Jackson had hidden from them, understanding perhaps better than anyone in that hangar how easily good people could be misled by someone they trusted in a position of authority. Riley, in particular, absorbed his guidance with visible eagerness, asking questions about the hydraulic system and the fuel lockout mechanism that revealed a genuine hunger to understand rather than simply follow procedure. Amelia found herself drawn into the process as well, standing closer to the technical bay than she had at any point earlier in the night, listening to Mason explain the reasoning behind each verification step in language she could actually follow. It struck her somewhat uncomfortably how rarely she had taken time to understand the technical realities beneath her company's operations, preferring instead to trust reports and summaries handed up to her by people whose motives she had never seriously questioned. She resolved, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, that this particular oversight in her leadership would not continue past tonight. The full inspection took nearly 2 hours, methodical and unhurried despite the looming contract deadline, because Mason refused to rush a process meant to guarantee human safety regardless of the financial pressure bearing down on the company. When the final system passed its verification check, he signed off alongside Riley and 2 other technicians, presenting Amelia with a complete, honestly documented safety certification rather than the falsified paperwork Jackson had grown accustomed to producing. Amelia reviewed the documents carefully before authorizing the flight, feeling a strange, unfamiliar pride in a certification process she had actually witnessed rather than merely trusted on faith. The jet departed several hours later than originally planned, its delay explained honestly to the shipping partner as a matter of thorough safety review rather than concealed through vague corporate language. To Amelia's genuine surprise, the partner's representative responded not with anger but with something closer to relief and respect, telling her plainly that a company willing to delay a lucrative contract for the sake of verified safety was exactly the kind of partner they wanted to continue working with long-term. Mason, watching the jet climb steadily into the evening sky from the hangar entrance, declined every suggestion that he step forward as some kind of public hero for the cameras that had begun gathering outside. He wanted only for the people who had labored alongside him that night to finally be paid what they had honestly earned. In the days that followed, Amelia made good on every promise she had spoken inside the hangar, beginning with the delayed wages owed to her contract mechanics and hourly technicians, all of which were paid in full, along with a modest bonus meant to acknowledge the months of unfair delay they had endured. She did not frame it as charity or generosity, understanding by then that it was simply the payment these workers had already earned through labor she had allowed to go unrecognized for far too long. The gesture spread quietly through the company, earning her a measure of trust among the staff that no press statement could have manufactured on its own. She personally arranged the $10 million payment owed from the original wager, presenting Mason with a certified check during a quiet meeting held away from cameras and investors, a deliberate choice on her part to avoid turning his integrity into another spectacle for public consumption. Alongside the check, she offered a sincere, unscripted apology, acknowledging aloud that she had judged him entirely by his appearance and his circumstances rather than by the competence he had demonstrated within minutes of stepping into her hangar. Mason accepted the apology with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, neither dismissing her words nor demanding further contrition beyond what she had already offered. To her genuine surprise, Mason did not intend to keep the full sum for himself, explaining that a man who had once needed flexible, undervalued work simply to remain present for his daughter understood too well what other struggling workers in this industry faced every single day. He proposed instead that a significant portion of the money be used to establish a training fund for young mechanics entering the aviation field, alongside a separate support fund for the families of aviation laborers who often worked long, unpredictable hours for wages far below what their skills genuinely warranted. Amelia agreed without hesitation, recognizing in his proposal the same quiet integrity that had guided every decision he made since the moment she had thrown that crumpled bill at his feet. She kept the original $100 bill herself, having it framed and mounted in her office where she would see it every morning before beginning her workday. It served not as a trophy or a memento of victory, but as a deliberate, uncomfortable reminder of the arrogance that had nearly cost her far more than a contract or a wager that night. Visitors to her office sometimes asked about the strange, plain object hanging beside far more impressive awards and certifications, and she answered honestly each time, telling them briefly about the man she had once dismissed as worthless and nearly lost the chance to truly understand. Mason returned to his ordinary life not long after, choosing to remain in contract work by preference rather than accepting Amelia's repeated offers of a formal, permanent position within her company. He walked out of that hangar the same way he had walked into it months earlier, calm and unhurried, carrying nothing more than his tools and the quiet satisfaction of having done honest work under difficult circumstances. This time, however, as he crossed the concrete floor toward the exit, not a single person in that building dared to call him a cheap mechanic ever again, and the silence that followed him out was one of respect rather than dismissal. If you believe someone the world underestimates can still rewrite their own destiny, stay with this story until the very end.